Well, it's a great pleasure to be here again. I've been with William Paterson several times before, but it's been a few years. And I want to make sure to thank Professor Derek Patrick for asking me to come again. This is the second historic piano that's been on this stage. And, but I'm going to begin fairly quickly in the interest of saving time with the presentation. Then we're going to mix some music in as we go along. Why are we talking about a piano builder who died in 1851, about the year that Steinway started up in New York making the instrument that is our modern piano? It's because of the associations that he had with so many famous artists, from Beethoven to Schumann to Franz Liszt, people who admired his work. It's also a curious rags to riches story of a man who was an orphan at an early age, who learned to be a carpenter's apprentice and a cabinet maker, who wandered to Vienna and somehow managed to become the greatest piano builder in Europe in the first half of the 19th century. And so this is Conrad Graf. He was born in the city of Riedlingen. He was certainly the foremost piano builder in Vienna in the 19th century. He was at once a master of his trade, a successful businessman, patron of the arts, collector of contemporary and historical paintings, and one of the most intriguing figures in Biedermeier, Vienna. He was born in humble circumstances in 1782 in Riedlingen, Germany, a small town on the Danube, as the son of a master tanner. Tanners, of course, are people who make leather, and leather figures very prominently in these early pianos, so this isn't just something coincidental. From 1300 to 1800, Riedlingen was located in what was called Vorderösterreich. It was the farthest province of Austria, so essentially he was an Austrian. It was one of the 5 cities on the Danube River that was controlled by the Habsburg Empire. That was a picture of the town that I just passed by. This is the Danube, the way it looks behind the tanners' houses in Riedlingen. It's just a stream there, it's not navigable yet. He had 6 years of schooling in Riedlingen. There's no direct evidence that he had any musical training whatsoever. In 1793, when he was 10, his father died. 2 years later, he was apprenticed to a master cabinet maker. And after completing his apprenticeship, he found his way to Vienna in 1798. He served briefly in the army as a sharpshooter in a volunteer unit. They were fighting, of course, against Napoleon. And around 1801, Graf began to work as a cabinet maker's apprentice with the piano builder Jakob Schelple in a suburb very close to Vienna called Währing. In November of 1802, Graf was only a year into his apprenticeship. Schelple died at age 37. 2 years later, Graf married his widow, Katharina, and took over the workshop. By 1810, he had 10 apprentices working with him in his small factory. In 1811, he moved the workshop to Vienna. His early extant instruments have the address Wieden number 80182, which was the address there. Why did they put their address on the front of a piano? Because there was no other way that somebody could contact them if they wanted to buy one. In 1814, Graf's wife, Katharina, died, leaving him to care for his stepdaughter, Carolina, and his own daughter, Juliana. His reputation as the greatest piano maker in Vienna was established very quickly. There's this extraordinary report in a German newspaper called the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. This was a newspaper that came out every week, dedicated totally to the world's events in music. We should be so lucky to have something like that today. 2 important royal guests paid a visit to his factory and also picked out some of his instruments. The local piano builder, Conrad Graf, had the honored recognition of a visit from Her Majesty the Duchess Maria Luisa of Parma and His Majesty Archduke Rudolf, Cardinal Archbishop of Olmütz, who not only toured with approval his entire extensive establishment, but also ordered certain of his instruments. In fact, this tireless artist manufactures the most excellent pianofortes. They do not find an equal in beauty, consistency, strength, fullness of tone, and their solidity of construction ensures their durability. More durable than this is hard to imagine after being built in 1828. His unceasing endeavor to achieve the highest possible perfection in his instruments and his attempt at quadruple strung unisons have delivered the most beautiful results. The foremost virtuosos in the imperial city make use of these same instruments at their performances. The royal guests were none other than Duchess Maria Luisa of Parma. She was the oldest daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I and the second wife of French Napoleon I, of course. She married him, incidentally, in a very curious way. She'd never met him. They were married at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Venice, and somebody stood in for Napoleon. She had never met him on the day she married him. They met halfway between Paris and Vienna in carriages, and the first thing Napoleon insisted upon was the wedding night. Maybe being a noble wasn't everything it's supposed to be. If she bought a Fortepiano from Graf in 1820, the instrument has not been identified. Here's Maria Luisa and also Archduke Rudolph. Rudolph was a student of Beethoven's and dedicated many works to him, including the Archduke Trio. In 1824, Graf was awarded the title as the imperial and royal forte purveyor to the Viennese court. Every apartment in the Viennese Hofburg was reported to have a Graf piano. By 1826, the increased demand for his instruments led to a development of a specific organized method to increase production. His final workshop in a Viennese dance hall called the Mondschein House provided space for 40 workers, many of whom lived on the premises. Two contemporary sources mention that the workers were organized into 8 different specific groups, which concentrated on becoming excellent in only one phase of piano construction. Graf was famous for his selection of beautiful veneers, soundboards of highest quality, and the highest quality materials in general. The Austrian Encyclopedia noted in 1835 that his factory was the largest and most famous in Vienna and the entire Austrian Empire. In 1835, he was awarded a gold medal for a fortepiano he displayed at the Industrial Exhibition in Vienna. Gustav Schilling commented about Graf in his Universal Lexikon der Tonkunst, favored by fortune with a restless zeal and indefatigable work ethic, he moved quickly from obscurity. His industry, experimentation, and perpetual striving finally raised his art to a rare perfection. Semper altius, always higher, remained his motto. 30 years later, he's richly rewarded for his high standards and meritorious endeavors. He made infinitely more money than all the composers I'm going to talk about, except perhaps Franz Liszt. His instruments are not only the most sought after on the continent, but they also cross the oceans and even sound in other hemispheres. All his instruments enjoy the benefit of a particular strength in construction, durability in tuning, along with a sonorous and rich voice. Graf stayed pretty much close to Vienna throughout his career, but he did make a couple of trips, and the most extraordinary one was in 1837, when accompanied by his good friend, the composer, teacher, and virtuoso pianist Carl Czerny, he journeyed to London and Paris. But first, he made a stop at his birthplace. The chronicler in the town of Riedlingen provides this description of his return home. On March 7, 1837, Conrad Graf from Vienna, a native son, passed through here on his journey to Paris in a magnificent 3-in-hand travel coach. Everyone who knew him when he wandered away from here in wretched clothing as a craftsman apprentice was astonished. Actually, he had the good luck in Vienna as a cabinet maker's apprentice to marry the widow of an instrument maker. He did not forget on his return the poverty of his origins and his needy ancestors. Instead, he supported them in a manner which inspired the respect of the entire local citizenry. Before his departure, he gave presents to all of the poor who visited him in droves. God bless the generous. The purpose of the trip for Czerny was that he had publishers in all of these cities that they were visiting. And so Czerny was doing that, while at the same time, Conrad Graf was visiting piano factories. By 1837, his means of building pianos completely out of wood, except for the strings and some other parts, had become old-fashioned. The other European centers, Berlin and Paris, were making pianos with metal reinforcing inside to improve the tuning and also to improve the stability. The keyboards were getting larger and larger, the pitch was going up higher, and so Graf, I think, was studying to see if he could possibly compete with these new inventions and new ideas. In sum, he eventually decided to quit, and in 1841 he ceased building pianos. But one interesting thing happened on this trip. In London, Graf and Czerny were invited to an audience with the Queen. And the Queen and Czerny played four-hand piano together. I don't know what piano they were using, probably an English Broadwood. But Graf was also invited to this audience. What Queen would that have been? 1837? Anybody know? Queen Victoria, just a few weeks into her reign. But she was a pianist, and by the way, she also spoke German, since her mother was German-speaking. Charlotte Moscheles, who was the wife of a famous composer-pianist, mentioned that Graf came to London and found only fault with all the London makers. They were too heavy in touch, others too muffled. The English pianos were famous for having very inefficient damping, which I'm sure he criticized, and that Graf thought only his own were the best. This instrument that you see on the left is in the Nürnberg Deutsches Museum in Germany. This is the kind of instrument that he built for the high nobility. It's all covered with bronze ornamentation called ormolu. The keys are covered with mother of pearl, the white keys, and the sharps are covered with tortoiseshell veneer. Graf has the invention, actually, for doing this kind of veneering. Many famous pianists and composers, including Beethoven, Czerny, Schubert, Clara, Robert Schumann, Mendelssohn, Chopin, and Liszt, either owned Graf pianos or preferred to play them in their Viennese concerts. In 1841, at age 58, Graf retired wealthy and famous. In the same year, he sold his piano factory, and 10 years later, he died of pneumonia at his house in Vienna. Why did he give up his business at an age which might seem young to us today, at age 58? In Austria, at that time, it was actually a ripe old age. There's a report from the period that indicates that life expectancy in Vienna during the period was only 30 years for men and 33 years for women. The numbers are skewed by the incredible infant mortality rate, but still, when we look at the lives of Mozart and Beethoven and many others, Schubert, who died young, it's clear that it probably wasn't a very healthy place. During his 37 years of building pianos, Graf built approximately 3,000 instruments. Your program notes indicate that 190 still exist. The number is now closer to 200. But still, it's a relatively small number considering the elegance of these instruments and how many were made. By comparison, Stradivarius built about 1,100 violins, and among those, about half of them, more than half, around 650, still exist. The reason simply is that the violin was very near the end of its development as an instrument in the early Romantic period, whereas the piano was still changing very rapidly every decade. There were new ideas and new construction methods. This is a price list of Graf's instruments. The cheapest instrument that he made cost 400 ducats. In Vienna during the period, a school teacher made approximately 100 ducats a year. So it meant it would have been 4 years total salary to buy one of his instruments. You have all this information about the instrument on the handout sheet. There's no reason to go through that again. This is his characteristic nameplate indicating that he's the imperial and royal fortepiano maker to the Viennese court. And again, there's his address down below, so if you want to order one, you know where to write. The provenance of this instrument is Sweden. I've actually taken 4 Graf pianos out of Sweden. The Swedes never throw anything away, and they haven't had wars for a very long time, so that's why there are so many rare instruments there. It was owned by a family whose children actually had their piano lessons on the instrument in the 1970s. When the children left, they made the instrument into a bar and were serving drinks over the top of it. And that explains why it had to be repolished. The finish, by the way, is what's called French polish. It's applied by hand. Very thin coats of shellac are applied over and over and over again until you get this high, bright luster. And what's wonderful about it, it never goes bad, the way oil and varnish finishes do. At an unknown date, the instruments had its strings replaced with modern steel wire instead of the iron original ones, and modern tuning pins were driven into the pin blocks, splitting it apart. But still, there were many original parts. The hammers, the dampers, all of those things were still original and are still working. The instrument still has its original dampers. I bet anything that in 150 or 60 or 70 years there won't be any Steinways around with their original dampers still in them. There are 4 pedals in the instrument altogether, which I thought we might just illustrate for a moment. Some of these instruments had as many as 6 pedals to provide various sound effects. 2 of them on the extreme right and the extreme left are similar to a modern piano. There's a shift pedal that moves the keyboard over so that the hammers only strike 2 of the 3 strings of the unison. And then there's the damper lift, or the sostenuto or sustain pedal that lifts the dampers up so that you get the long ringing sound. There's also something you can see in this picture. If you look over the soundboard, they had an acoustic cover. I've taken it off for this trip because in a big room like this, we don't want to make the piano sound smaller than it is. But there was actually a way of reducing the sound and reducing the brilliance of the overtones with this wooden shield over the soundboard. Let me show you what the other pedals look like. This is the moderator. You're looking down through the strings at the hammers and this rail of felt tabs that come in between the hammers and the strings. And maybe we can hear a little bit if you don't mind, and just get an idea what the moderator sounds like. Yeah. Bach never had a piano like this, but it doesn't matter. It still sounds great. Try it without, just for the contrast. Without the moderator. We'll hear some examples of that again, too, in the performances that Professor Kirkpatrick is going to play. Some of these pianos also had a curious pedal that produced percussive sound effects. It was called the Janissary Pebble. And the way it worked was when you pressed the pedal, the 3 bells on the side of the case would ring. They were usually pitched in A minor. And then a brass bar would come down on the lower strings, making a kind of cymbal effect. And if you really punched the pedal with your foot, you would get the soundboard drum, which was a big leather mallet that came up and struck the soundboard from the underside. And this was used for battle pieces. If you lift the dampers when you did this, you'd get a sound like a cannon going off. It was a novelty effect. I think most serious composers really frowned on these contrivances, as did the builders. But they said if they want to pay for them, people can have them. The bassoon is something that this instrument has, and also the Beethoven's piano had the same thing. A lower layer of parchment is lowered down onto the lower strings, producing a kind of sizzling effect that reminded people of the bassoon, apparently. I think you're on the right pedal. Are you getting it? Oh yeah, okay, I wasn't hearing it from over there. It could be a little bit better regulated on this piano. Most pianists, when they play this instrument, detach that pedal because they don't want to hit it by mistake in the wrong place. This is a look at the hammers. Compared to the modern felt hammer, they're very different. They're laminations of leather that, just want to make sure I don't go over time here, that the quality of this leather is extremely important, and it really distinguishes a great piano builder from one who's not as good. The Fortepiano can't really sustain the same length of tone or volume contrast of a modern instrument, but the rapid decay of the sound means that you can play very, very rapidly and get a clear articulation. Well, first I'm going to talk about Graf and Beethoven. They were very close friends. Even before the revival of the Fortepiano, one often heard Graf's name mentioned because he provided Beethoven with a free piano around the end of Beethoven's life. Around 1825, Graf loaned Beethoven a piano from his earlier period that had quadruple strung unisons, 4 strings per note. And many people have come to the conclusion that he was trying to give Beethoven a little bit more sound. Beethoven, of course, nearly completely deaf. Actually, Graf experimented with these instruments early in his career and then gave it up as unsuccessful. And this is an unnumbered instrument from Graf's early period. And when Beethoven died, Graf reclaimed it. He was fully aware that it increased enormously in value by the fact that Beethoven had owned it. He may have thanked Beethoven, however, for the loan by giving Beethoven the piano sonata in E minor, opus 90. The autograph score has Graf's name on the margin of the first page. Graf is also frequently mentioned in Beethoven's conversation books. He went on outings in the countryside with Beethoven. One of them, they sang a comic canon that Beethoven had just jotted off called Kühl, nicht lau, cool, not lukewarm, cool in the old sense, a pun on the name of the composer Friedrich Kuhlau, who was also present. Beethoven died on the 26th of March, 1827. Graf and Schubert were both torchbearers at Beethoven's funeral. This is the Beethoven Graf piano. It's in the Beethoven birthhouse in Bonn, Germany. There was a big international congress in Vienna from November 1814 to June of 1816 to mark the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Its purpose was to try to secure the peace and redefine Europe's borders. Many international dignitaries came from all over the world, and certainly the piano was a very hot item, and people would have visited the piano shops in Vienna. We know that Graf had many, many visitors during this time. We also know that Schubert's Mass in F major was performed during the Congress, and that many visitors from the Congress itself were present when the Mass was performed. And afterward, Schubert's father apparently bought a piano from Graf to give to his son. In 1821, Schubert's famous song Erlkönig was premiered at the Court Theater in Vienna. Schubert's friend Anselm Hüttenbrenner reported, "I played the accompaniment on a new piano by Conrad Graf. Schubert was so shy that he couldn't be persuaded to accompany. He stood next to me and turned pages instead." The vocalist was Schubert's friend, the famous operatic baritone Johann Michael Vogel. In 1824, Schubert advised Anna von Hartmann to buy a piano by one of Vienna's best builders, putting Graf in first place. We can't link Chopin directly with a specific Graf piano, but we know from his letters that he preferred to play on Graf's instruments during his concerts in Vienna in 1829 and 1830, when he was still in his teens. On the 12th of September 1829, Chopin wrote, "3 piano manufacturers have all offered to send me their forte pianos. I declined because the room is too tiny. At the concert, I sat down to a magnificent instrument by Graf, perhaps the finest in Vienna." For the second tour in 1830, Chopin wrote, "As soon as we move in, Graf will send us an instrument. I go to Graf every day after dinner to play and exercise my stiff fingers a little after the journey." There's absolutely no reason in the world why one cannot play Chopin's early music, particularly on a Graf piano. And I thought it might be a good time to mix some music into this, perhaps, and hear what Chopin sounds like on a wood-framed piano instead of on a modern Steinway. There are a lot of effects that you can do with the fortepiano that are difficult to do on the modern piano just because it makes so much sound, particularly in the lower register. And it's very clear that Beethoven, for example, very frequently intended long passages to be played with the damper pedal down because the sound decays so quickly on this instrument, it doesn't ring on forever. You can have effects, it was almost a kind of harp-like effect where the sound all sort of melts together. I think the beginning of the Moonlight Sonata is a very good example of that. But you have a thought of something? I'm not using the pedal here. I was actually thinking of leaving the pedal down the whole passage without, see what happens. It's a magical effect. If you tried to do it on the piano, it would be awful on a modern instrument. Anything that's technological, obviously, as time goes on and we have progress, there are things that are improved and things that fall by the wayside. And I think you can hear some of these things in these earlier pianos. There's a delicacy of sound. There's an attempt to explore the regions of softness that go far beyond what's going on in music today. Another important relationship with Graf was Franz Liszt, who visited Vienna several times in the 1830s and 40s, and every time he performed on Graf pianos. For the concert on the 18th of April 1838, Clara Schumann was in the audience and commented, Liszt played the Concertstücke by Webern. At the beginning, 3 brass strings broke on the Graf piano. Who can describe it? The missing strings didn't even bother him. He must be used to it. He just played around it as though the strings weren't there. Liszt gave 8 concerts altogether in Vienna during April and May of 1838. Each concert was reviewed, and here are a couple of extracts. Liszt played on the same 2 Graf instruments that we've already heard. Their beauty and clarity of tone are praiseworthy. This time the strings held, and so did the tuning. We often reproach the piano, saying that it can be a limited instrument, little capable of generating truly grand effects. In the Weber Concerto, Liszt asserted the power of the instrument against a fully engaged orchestra with his fiery, full-voiced performance. Liszt produced an impression on the audience that was more powerful than any I've ever experienced. The piano was a Graf. The instrument distinguished itself excellently with its full, beautiful, emphatic, and equal tone, and it withstood the trial of fire of a Liszt concert consummately well. In 1840, Graf commissioned the painting Liszt at the Keyboard from the Austrian artist Josef Danhauser. The painting has been tentatively identified, the piano in the painting has been identified as Opus 2787, now in the museum in Vienna. Graf's name is on the piano. The whole subject itself is dominated by the presence of Beethoven. The artist's signature at the bottom makes it clear that it was commissioned by Graf himself in remembrance of Liszt's performances. The portrait depicts many famous people from Liszt and also Graf's circle of friends, including the standing figures. Let me go back to the painting for a minute. Standing, looking toward Beethoven, as Liszt is, are the violin virtuoso Paganini and the composer Rossini. Then on the far left, there's a trio of literati, sort of a triangle. There's Victor Hugo, Georges Sand, and Alexander Dumas Père. Distinguished company indeed. And kneeling at the keyboard is the Countess Marie de Goulle, who was Liszt's mistress. He had 3 children with her, and one of them went on to marry Richard Wagner, but that's another lecture. One interesting thing, Georges Sand, who's seated, is smoking a cigar, and also dressed in drag. She was a very famous feminist who liked to enrage people by her behavior. Because Roth commissioned the portrait, we probably also determined who should be represented. Liszt, at age 29, is the only pianist in the group, his glance transfixed on Beethoven, another of Graf's clients. Beethoven looms larger than life. He's actually not on the piano, he's floating outside the window as though he's dominating the whole area. I think I've talked about the rest of this. There's one more lithograph that shows Liszt at the keyboard, probably also commissioned by Graf. Here we see the artist Josef Krehuber on the left. Standing are Hector Berlioz and Karl Czerny, and on the far right is the violinist Heinrich Wilhelm Ernst, who was a virtuoso similar to Paganini in his brilliance. On the right is the Graf piano that was given to Clara Schumann, Opus 2616. At this point, Graf had gone to a more elaborate name board. All of this writing is actually inlaid brass, which is then inset into the keyboard. This instrument still exists. By the way, on the keyboard, you can see what Liszt was playing. He was playing Beethoven's Sonata in A-flat major, Opus 110, and his own Hungarian melodies. Graf gave this instrument to Clara Wieck about a year before she married Robert Schumann in 1840. She had visited Graf's workshop in 1838, heard Liszt play there, nearly fainted in the process because she was so overwhelmed by it. There's a lot of writing that indicates that this was a wedding present for Clara Schumann, which is not true. It was simply a gift recognizing her importance and brilliance as a player. Here's Graf toward the end of his career, seated at his desk. There's a design of a keyboard that you can't really make out in the painting. And this is his factory, this famous building that was next to the landmark Karlskirche in Vienna. The buildings no longer exist. In 1841, when he retired, he was very, very wealthy, and he built a magnificent four-story building in Vienna that still stands today. It's just right behind St. Stephen's Cathedral, and just out of curiosity, I was in Vienna not too long ago, and I decided to see if I could find out if anybody related to Graf was still there. And sure enough, a great-great-great-grandson was still in this building, renting out apartments just as his Großvater had done. Graf was married in a cemetery that no longer exists in Vienna, but there are a few of the honor graves that are still extant, one of which has a musical motif and might have been his, although it lost its inscription. The singer that I mentioned before, Vogel, was also buried there, as was Beethoven's brother. In a later epoch, there are two other instruments that are interesting. The one on the left is the piano that Giacomo Puccini used to rehearse the first rehearsals for the opera Tosca. And Gustav Mahler, the composer, also had a Graf piano. These were already very archaic at the time, of course. So, anyway, I thought now we might actually turn to this is the great-great-great-grandson of Graf in his apartment. And looking out of one of the windows of the apartment, it looks down on the only house in Vienna that we know that still exists that Mozart lived in, the so-called Figaro house. And so it's looking out of one of the windows of the house down onto a neighboring house on a closely by street. So we've got some time left. It might be interesting to demonstrate a few more things, maybe whatever you'd like.
What I would like to do is go back to Beethoven and the long pedals. I'm sure those of you who are familiar with the Tempest Sonata, you know, there's that, in the development, there's this long recitative, and Beethoven marks a long pedal throughout it, over an A major chord and then over a C major chord. So I'd like to demonstrate that, and then in the last movement of the Waldstein Sonata, he has a very long pedal over a 1 and a 5/7. And on the modern piano, it's really a bit of a nightmare because we have to either flutter pedal or half pedal. And in the Tempest, we have to do little tricks to make it sound like Beethoven wanted. But I'm going to play it on this piano, and you'll hear how clear it can come through. And then, lastly, I'll talk about another Beethoven feature. Beethoven has in the last movement octaves marked 5-1 all the way down, and it was customary to play an octave glissando, which again today many pianists do not. They divide it between 2 hands or they play like wrist octaves. But on this piano, glissandi are a treat and fun to play. The keys are a little bit shallower, a little bit narrower, and you could play octave glissandi, glissandi in sixths, Liszt wrote glissandi like that. So I'll switch to that.
Kind of like that. I'd just like to make one other comment before I quit. The reason that there are so few pianos like this left is that after a while they were superseded by newer and more modern instruments. There were actually big bonfires that were made of old pianos, and they were just burned up. There was a famous one in Atlantic City around the turn of the century where they made a gigantic bonfire of old pianos. Who knows what was lost there? Could have been anything. And just in case you think that's not still happening, it's happening over and over and over again today. We're in danger of losing the history of the American piano industry as all of the old, beautiful old upright pianos that were made are being taken to the dump or they're trashed. So it can happen in our own time just as well. There are piano movers that are making a cottage industry of picking up pianos that nobody's playing and trashing them. And it's a terrible pity, I think, because of all of the work and time and expertise that's gone into building these instruments. One other thing about this piano, I mentioned the book matching of the veneer. The cabinet makers during this period were real artists. And what they did was they would take a log with a nice pattern in it and cut it into many different pieces. And then they would take it and reverse the panels like this. So you would have one side that's the front of the panel and the other is the back. And because the hue of the wood on the front and the back of a cut piece of wood is slightly different, you not only get this heart-shaped pattern, but you get dark light, dark light, dark light in the finishing. Sometimes they would cover that up with stain. But when we were redoing this piano, I decided I liked it like this. It was originally, it had a darker reddish stain, but I just liked it natural, and he did make something like this, so it's not a mistake, I don't think. But I also want to say another thing, and that is that I've been on the road with this piano at Oberlin, Ann Arbor, Skidmore College, and the finest and most expressive piano playing I've heard on it was right here. Finito.